You are listening to Catholic Family Podcast.
I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast, and I'm very happy to be joined again, or not again, I shouldn't say again. I'm being joined by another, I guess you could call him maybe a lay theologian. Let's call him a lay writer about Sedevacantism and the Catholic faith. That is Mr. Griff Ruby, and today we're going to talk about where he comes from, a few of the books that he has written on the topic that's very near and dear to our hearts. And a couple of those books, I think we're going to actually have a couple episodes because this is some deep stuff. We had a conversation a couple of days ago that went on for, I don't know, maybe an hour or so. And it was really fascinating. And it didn't even touch on the surface of anything. So we may have a 10-part series. I don't know how far we're going to go in this series, but it's really exciting. And before we get going, I do want to say that like, I had on Bishop Donald Sanborn a couple months ago, and he talked about the thesis of Catholicism, and it didn't necessarily fit what I believe to be the solution to Sedevacantism. And honestly, that's okay. I don't think we always have to agree on everything in order to have guests on, and as long as there's no heresy involved, obviously, and as long as there's no, deep, mistakes, then I think we need to talk these things through and maybe possibly even disagree with people. I'm not saying I'm going to disagree with Mr. Ruby, but he has opinions that may not necessarily reflect my opinions or the opinions of those who are, involved with the Catholic Family Podcast. I just want to state that. And it's the same with Bishop Sanborn. I respect the opinions. I don't necessarily agree with them, and that's okay. Remember that in today's day and age, we got to remember that it's okay to disagree, and maybe disagreement leads to good conversation, and perhaps good conversation leads to truth. And so also, before we get going, I have to warn you that my daughter is playing on a phone in the background. Don't tell my wife because she's not here. My daughter's rarely on a phone, but right now she's listening to Celtic music over there. So you may hear a little bit in background, so I apologize for that. So if there's any little bit of noise going on or I'm a little distracted, it's because Sophia is over here right beside me. So Mr. Ruby, I'm sorry, after that 2-minute explanation, I would love to bring you in and just maybe you could tell me a little bit about yourself, where you come from, and then we're going to get it right into your books and your beliefs on the Sedevacantist situation. So who are you?
Okay. Well, that's great. I just noticed that you said she's listening to Celtic music. That's I wish I could hear some of it, but that's okay.
It's the best, right? It's the best.
I won't worry about that now. So getting to the thing, my background was kind of convoluted because it started with me being raised just basically, I wouldn't say atheistic as in, rejecting God, but just God wasn't mentioned at all in our household. I didn't know. I mean, I may have been vaguely aware that there were places called churches and people go to them at various times. I didn't know when, because there was a Lutheran church that I would walk through as a little kid. My mom would give me like a penny when I'm 3 or 4 years old, and I would walk down the street, through an alleyway, across the street, through another alleyway, across another street, into an alleyway that kind of branches off at the back of a Lutheran church, and I would walk across that whole property, past kind of a main building, and they had some little school rooms because I guess they had an attached school, clear down to the corner, then across a fairly major street, and then across the parking lot to the 5 and Dime, where I get one stick of gum, Bazooka Joe, and I'd be chewing it all the way home. So, you can't do that today. I mean, I'm 3, 4, 5, whatever it is, years old. Wandering halfway across town. You can't do that now. But in those days, people didn't worry about that sort of stuff, and they didn't have to. So, I don't for a moment believe my mom did anything wrong, and that it was just, a different time. So. But I grew up, so that's about what I knew. Is I'd walk through the facility any number of times and probably glance in at a time or two. That's what I knew of that. Oh, and my mom had a tiny Christmas decoration. It was the only one, mom and dad, the only one that was kind of religiously themed. It was a little baby in the manger set about this tall, carved out of wood, actually kind of a nice little thing. And it had all these little pieces you could arrange. This thing that was actually looked like a bench, which actually, if you look at the top of it, it's supposed to be the baby in the manger, a little Joseph, a little Mary, and all this kind of stuff. And I looked at that, but I didn't really understand. I'm thinking, that's the mother of Jesus. and maybe some mention Jesus was God. Well, does that mean it was God? Maybe, well, does that mean Joseph the father? Maybe what, his spirit was the strongest and that's God? That's how, when you're 5-something years old and nobody talks about this stuff at all. So I come into high school so blank slate that when the Gideons came to my high school, they had these little free New Testament with Psalms and Proverbs Bibles, a rather rare edition, by the way, because it's got the Berkeley Revised Edition, unlike usually where they always have the King James. It's kind of unusual, but kind of cool in a way. But at any rate, they handed these things out. I am reading this thing. I'm actually interested to read it, so I guess they accomplished their mission in my case. And I'm reading all of this, and I'm going through. I didn't know a thing about the whole story of Jesus at all. He healed things. I didn't know that. Then, as the obvious bad guys are kind of circling him, like so many vultures, it's like, how's he going to escape? So then, after that, he doesn't escape. He gets crucified. What? I mean, what happens now? And then he comes back to life, and I'm just kind of like, ooh, I'm in the twilight zone here. So it was all absolutely new to me. So it's kind of a different experience when you come across the gospel. And I'm 14 years old, not as a baby growing up and having this constantly surrounding me, and I just take it as second nature. This is all something new to me. So that was the beginning of a very long and very convoluted course. I spent time as for some reason, I even reacted against it as an atheist. Then I moved into the Jehovah's Witnesses for a while, and then I spent some time with more generic Protestants of the sort that Gideons would have approved of, I would have to say, and then some time with Pentecostals, and then so it's, I had a few side journeys into other areas where I knew it wasn't going to go anywhere, but that it was worth studying. Because I do, I'm kind of one of these intellectuals. I like to study stuff and understand where things are coming from and really dig in deep. So I even had a little side journey into Mormonism just to look into that as well. So at any rate, I've been through all these different ways. And in my experience with the Protestant churches, the best ones had been the ones where there was just some pastor who was a real superstar. One guy had built his church, congregation, whatever you want to call it, literally from scratch. He had just been preaching out on the highways and byways of Isla Vista, the college town next to UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara, and just kind of gathered crowds around him until they could rent a small space somewhere and then a bigger space. And by the time I'm come along, he's now 40 years old, and he's got a whole great big congregation with several hundred people coming in it for each of 2 different services in the morning. And, it's a really big established thing. He built this all up from scratch, and it was great. He was funny. He was intelligent and impressed me a lot. And in some ways, although I know he wasn't a great theologian, all he did was read the Bible a lot. And that was it. Well, I think he read some Protestant. I mean, he could quote, Dwight Lyne Moody and, some of these other figures that were kind of prominent, Protestant authors and so forth. So I guess he must have been reading some of that too, which kind of tainted him. But at any rate, despite what he had to read, it was like he went above what he read. And that was a kind of neat thing. And I could see that. Well, he decides to graduate to going to a seminary for the first time, a Protestant seminary out in Ohio somewhere, out in California. So he just disappears, and suddenly there's just nobody able to fill his shoes. And that was very tragic, and it was that was a hard time for me, spiritually speaking, because it was, I lose that, and it wasn't like there was another one of him that some, great big denomination can just send in and pick up where he left off. And then I had the same thing again somewhat later on. I'm arriving to the town where I live now. I find this nice little friendly church, and again, you got this pastor who was a gentleman and a scholar, and a really good guy. I mean, he was actually familiar with the early church fathers and, drew a lot of stuff from them. And so that was, a cut above what you'd usually find. And then I was like, oh, okay, I'm happy here. And then he decides to graduate to the missionary field And they had to replace him with, well, this guy would probably do better selling used cars than trying to sell the faith. And it was bad. And once again, that was finally, I got tired of being, tossed about by every wind of doctrine. And
it seems, sorry, real quick, it seems like so much of that is based on charisma rather than actual doctrine, right? Or actual faith. A lot of it's based on actual personality.
Well, the charisma of these people I like is actually their doctrine, because they really explain things really well. Like taking this first pastor. By the way, both of these pastors have books that they've written. Grace Plus Nothing. Well, the book isn't the strongest selling point, but he had a neat, interesting thing. Your Protestants will quote Ephesians 2:8 and 9 about how the, I wish I had it in front of me. Well, I can't have it in front of me if you don't mind me looking this up here. Feel free to edit out the few seconds it takes to find this. Oh, tiny print. Okay. For by grace you've been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves is God's gift. It is not by works, so that no one may boast. Protestants love those. See, it's all faith. It's not works. Never mind what James said is his epistle, right? But what's so great, you don't even have to skip over to James. All you had to do, and this guy alone of all the Protestant leader type people I've ever met up with, figured out, well, let's look at the next verse. Ephesians 2:10. For we are his handiwork, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God previously prepared for us so that we should live in them.
Wow.
In other words, we are created for good works, which he prepared for us. Okay. So, and it's like I'm surprised. But you even talked about how, maybe this is a different passage, with fear and trembling even,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not, I received Jesus into my heart as my personal savior. I'm done. I'm sad. I'm saved. It doesn't matter what I do next, even if I want to be the son of Sam Killer or something,
Right.
So that's one kind of thing. And then like the other guy, once again, he also had written a book, not a terribly interesting one, but he did write one. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting to see that, the ones that I went for, it wasn't that they were really charismatic. The first one was kind of charismatic. He had a kind of humor about him at times, but it wasn't the humor. I like that, but it was that he really dug into the scriptures, and that I like a lot because I wanted to get into it. And in that time, I began to discover, because having been with the Jehovah's Witnesses, I have discovered that there can be deceptions. People can lie about the Bible. How bad? Well, okay. I'm going to just show one small example of something. Kingdom of the Cult by Walter Martin. I actually met Walter Martin once down in his place in Anaheim, California. He had a place there where he would, had a whole large congregation, sort of like a pastor, or sometimes he calls himself a pastor's pastor, because this is all about chapters on, I always say, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Christian Science, the Black Muslims, and Buddhists, Father Divine. I mean, he's got all these weird cults, and he writes about how they are and how they actually mislead people. And we'll get to something like that later on, but that's kind of a cool thing, So it really introduced me to the world of apologetics. And I loved learning about, how do we know what we know? I mean, there's probably a technical word and it escapes me at the moment. Epistemology, maybe, something like that, of our beliefs. Why do we believe what we believe? Do we just because we were raised in it? And that's all. I mean, a lot of people are raised in a lot of things. That doesn't prove anything about what anybody's been raised in, does it?
Right.
Okay. So, but I got tired of getting bounced around in these different Protestant groups that, they seem fine when you got one guy, but then I wanted something larger. And I started finding a few things of my own in Scripture. I started finding out that Mary was a virgin, always. Because she didn't say, how can this be? I'm a virgin doesn't make any sense, because, everyone's a virgin until they're not. But the Virgin Mary says to the angel, how can this be? For I am a virgin. Well, like I said, being a virgin is just, every girl's a virgin. They're born that way until they're not. So what's so mysterious about that? I mean, does she not understand the normal human process of, so of course not. But I look at that and I realize, no, it's because she's always meant to be a virgin. Now that becomes a little mysterious. How's that going to happen? And then the angel explains, the angel, the Lord will overshadow you, and you will have a son, and so on it goes. So that was one thing. Another thing I remember noticing was when Jesus Christ was at the Last Supper, and he's handing out, he's holding up this piece of bread, and he's saying, "This is my body." He didn't say, "This means my body. This represents my body. You and he gathering together and eating this together, that's not my body." He held this up, a piece of bread, and said, "This is my body." And it's like, if you're going to be a good Protestant fundamentalist, you should take the scripture seriously. That's what Jesus Christ called it. How dare I call it anything else? So then the idea of maybe becoming a Catholic begins just in the abstract, like something that could be a good idea. And that's when I decided I'm going to become a Catholic. And I've had some exposures a little bit, some reading of other, like ancient fathers. I knew of them. I'm almost ashamed to admit, of one of my fellow Protestants, a girl I was kind of sort of going with for a while, and that fell through. Had actually read Augustine's City of God. I still haven't read it yet, even now, to my shame. I'm sure it's a great classic, and I should get to it when I can read books again. But so she's kind of exposed to that kind of stuff. And so I am getting bits and pieces of these early fathers, and I'm always interested in where things have gone before. Interestingly enough, even in my days with the Jehovah's Witnesses, they've got their current literature that they're always trying to push and sell. But I wasn't content with that. I wanted to go all the way back. I wanted to go back to Charles Russell and his works and so forth. I wanted to read it. I wanted to take it from the ground up and watch the whole thing develop from the beginning to where we are, and so forth. So I did do some of that reading, and to this day I still have quite a library of that stuff, just out of the curiosity from that time. I never throw stuff away, or at least not if it's literary. So I still got books here that are from before I was a Catholic, and they've always been there in my YouTube videos. So I just kind of leave them there alone, even other things will shift around a bit, just to kind of like a motif. So getting on to the important stuff, I learned that things could be deceptive. There was even a small pamphlet actually titled "The Scholastic Dishonesty of the Jehovah's Witnesses." And by scholastic dishonesty, they're not talking about people cheating at exams, which is what you usually find if you Google scholastic dishonesty, but rather the way sources can be misquoted and misapplied. So I'm getting to the Novus Ordo. Well, I think the real interest at this point is from the Novus Ordo to Catholics, the full Catholic. I thought I had arrived. I didn't know that anything more existed. Well, I mean, I had this dim idea that people used to have a mass in Catholic, and a Catholic mass in Latin. Oh boy, let me get that one straight. We'd have a Catholic mass in Latin instead of the vernacular. And I thought to myself, well, it must be the same thing, just in Latin. I didn't know it was really a fundamentally different ceremony. And as it turns out, I'm even representing a fundamentally different religion. So let me see, I can silence this at once. Grand Central Station. So what I did is I joined, and when I went there was this very elderly Irish priest from the old school, very arch conservative. Even though he was doing Novus Ordos, there was kind of an atmosphere that he kind of sustained a little bit of the Catholicism that he'd been ordained to and had done, from the beginning. And well, kind of tried to do the new stuff in the old spirit, if you know what I mean. So I could kind of look at what there was there and say, I think this is what I'm looking for. And then when I made up with tradition, well, that's another good story there, because tradition was came in the person of a ex-nun of the CMRI. She had been with them in the days of Schuchart, but as Schuchart had gotten kind of wild and weird and difficult to deal with, she left that, and she didn't want to have anything more to do with him. Even when they got rid of Schuchart, she became a home aloner. So she would just say her Latin mass prayers at home, and that's all she believed existed anymore. I could not accept that. I never could. Oh, please. I could never accept that. And I think it's because, I mean, church is supposed to be church. Church is people. I mean, yeah, you could be stranded on a desert island. You do what you can, but why? I'm not on a desert island. I'm not in the middle of nowhere, even if my hometown here is more than an hour's drive from any Catholic masses at all. So I don't get as regularly as I would like, and then I do the prayers at home. But that's different. It's a matter of physical isolation. Obviously, local Novus Ordos don't mean anything to me any more than local Episcopalian or Methodist or you name it. Well, none of that matters to me. It's got nothing to do with my faith. So, but I didn't know what to make of all this. So I wanted to go up and visit her. So I drove all the way up. She was living in Spokane, and she pointed me up the hill to Mount St. Michael's. Says, well, it's not real because it doesn't have any jurisdiction. They have no right to be doing what they're doing, but you should at least see what a Catholic Mass really looks like and go there and see that. Also, there's great books they have at a bookstore up there. And my good friend from when I was one of their nuns, Sister Mary Gemma, is, runs the bookstore, and she can also help you find some really good stuff. So I do that. And I saw stuff I didn't know existed before. I was very impressed. And it wasn't what I expected, so it took a little getting used to. So, I mean, I'd understood by this point, I'd read some books, learned about this whole what's the difference between for you and for many versus for you and for all, and these sort of things. I was kind of disappointed that when the priest is saying that for you and for many, we're not hearing it. He's whispering that so silently. He could have been saying abracadabra mumbo jumbo. We'd never know. So that was kind of disappointing. But on the other hand, there was just the whole atmosphere of what was going on, which I had not seen before, and that was really impressing me. And it kind of had to settle in as I thought about it and meditated and realized this is what I was looking for.
And how many years approximately was it between, let's say, I don't know, the beginning of your conversion to this time at Mount St. Michael's?
That's 20 years about, because it's 1972. Yeah, I think it was 1972. The Gideons gave me this. Yeah. And 1974, I discovered the Jehovah's Witnesses. 1979, 80, somewhere in that time frame, I found that first really genius Protestant pastor. And 1984, almost going into 1985, when I arrived at the town here and met that next Protestant pastor. And then when he leaves, it's 1986, and that's when I'm thinking I'm going to become a Catholic, and I enter, well, really the Novus Ordo. And it's 1991 that I receive a first letter from Sister Cecilia, which was the ex-nun's, convent name. I don't know what name she had for herself. And 92, I was actually able to make the trip up to visit her and see Mount St. Michael. So from 72 to 92, that's a span of 20 years. I had to go the slow way. I had to start late.
Sometimes
and I
it's
had to
better.
take the slow way.
Yeah, I guess God works in different ways for every soul.
You can call it from some of the darkest places too. So, well, anyway, I was already getting into being a bit of an apologetic person, and I want to be able to defend Catholicism. And one other thing that's coming to mind, I I should show one other artifact from this that I think is of some interest. Is that I I began, as I learned more and so forth, I began writing articles. We're actually not getting up to about 2010 era, so maybe I'm kind of jumping over stuff, but it illustrates so beautifully why I'm so concerned about good scholarship is that you look at your sources, you look them up, do the due diligence, because if you don't, you can come up with all kinds of ideas. And one of the choicest ones I have, okay, comes out of The Faith of the Early Fathers, Volume 3, and there's a footnote, number 31, at the bottom of page 14 and top of page 15. Now, I don't know if you've ever read the Feeney, the thesis or whatever of Peter Dimond all about supporting his Feeneyism, but probably one of his single strongest quotes comes from this footnote right here. And it reads, as he quoted it, if there were not a constant tradition in the fathers that the gospel message of unless man be born again, et liqua, I guess in other words, water, is to be taken absolutely, it would be easy to say that our Savior simply did not see fit to mention the obvious exception of invincible ignorance and physical impossibility. But the tradition, in fact, is there, and it is likely enough to be found so constant as to constitute revelation. Well, when something's that universal, we regard it among the church fathers, we do regard something as revelation. And now it's saying the ancient fathers seem to know nothing about baptism of blood or desire. I mean, you hear that? That's a pretty darn persuasive quote, isn't it? I mean, it's a gut punch. But he only gave the quote in isolation. What I did is I had bought the Jurgen set. I found the quote. I looked it up, and in context, it reads, well, the first sentence is crucial. The state of infants who die without baptism has long been one of the knottiest problems of theology. If there were not, etc., etc. Okay, then we come down to the tail end. Constant as to constitute revelation, the church has always admitted baptism of desire as a rescuing factor when the desire is a personal and conscious one on the part of the one desiring baptism for himself, as in the case of a catechumen. I mean, you get the idea. In context, the quote is not saying anything surprising. The quote is definitely not supporting Father Feeney's unique interpretation of these things. And now you realize this is what I call scholastic dishonesty.
And that's Feeneyism. And you're so right that Feeneyism, or the Dimondites, as they're becoming called now, well, especially on Twitter, is they do that all the time. And they have the same talking points and same arguing points, and they will not answer your questions or your points about St. Alphonsus or St. Thomas. They'll just be like, nope, you're a heretic. Heretic. It is just they
won't even touch what I did. Some years before Stephen Spurey put out his book, I did, well, just maybe a year or two, I had a whole series on what I call, the whole series just addressing the subject. And it goes on for about, maybe 16 pieces so far. Strictly speaking, it's not complete. I could have more because there's other Feneyites that may have their own particular takes or things to address. But
so the big question is, have the Dimond brothers done a video about you yet? That's the important
well, point. They'll mention me in a few places, but they don't want to talk about it, and they definitely don't want to address any of the points I brought up.
I believe that.
I mean, I think there was one thing in a very early. I wrote a whole series. This particular item is from number 4 out of the series. Yeah, but my idea was that every installment I had to find at least one misquote that they had used and employed, or at least somebody had used and employed, because as I get towards the end, I'm finished with them and I start moving on to Father Feeney himself and some of the other Feeneyites and so forth. And I have to address their comments and their remarks. And again, I have to find something that gets quoted out of context and is made to sound like it says something different from what it really is saying. And I made that like a theme. Every installment had to have at least one, sometimes more than one, but at least one of these major exposures of one of their classic quotes, their talking points, whatever, that looks so good. I mean, that looked pretty scary, right? That first quote, right? I mean, if you didn't know where it came from or what the context was, wouldn't you be, wow, did the ancient fathers not know about blood, baptism of blood and desire? I mean, didn't that flash through your head at the time, right? Unless they have just not known. I mean, maybe the church developed this later on, or whatever, right? You'd think that, and then you look at the full context. What a debunking! I mean, and that's the strongest kind of debunking you can do. Is you
And
just do the
where can
due
people find these
diligence.
articles of yours?
What? Oh
Where can
yeah.
people find these articles?
Well, they were published on Daily Catholic, and let's see, where else can I? Maybe I should give you a link you can put in your, the write-up blurb for when you upload this. I have a link for just all the ones for the Feeney, all gathered with the little editorial blurbs that Michael Caine, the person who ran Daily Catholic, would, write a little blurb for me and it kind of introduce the article, and then there'd be the article itself, and then I would have different quotes, and the real quotes would just be at the black of the what I'm writing, and then different persons, especially the diamonds, would be given a different color ink, or, in the web page, and he would choose the color maroon, as in what a maroon, just a little subtle joke that you put in there. I hadn't noticed until he explained that to me, but so there's just these little subtle things that don't really matter. It's this kind of brownish whatever shade of brownish shade of red or whatever, but maroon, what a maroon.
And so on top of doing articles about Feeneyism, I mean, you've written a few books about
Yeah,
Sedevacantism, and we wanted to talk about, we're already at 30 minutes. Amazingly, this has gone really fast, which is always a good thing for me. So
good.
I mean, what was the first book that you wrote? I think you've written 3, and again, it may end up that this turns into a 3-part series. We'll see how it goes. But what was the
Oh, I'm sure
first
it'll
book you
have
wrote
to.
about the topic?
Well, let's talk about the history of that book. Okay. Well, the first one I published as the Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church. I'm just showing the current edition. The original doesn't look that much different, except now I'm saying updated and corrected edition. That's the only other obvious difference. But the point is, when I had this originally being worked on, well, there is a book preceding that, but it was an incomplete draft. And so I really don't count that. But I was going to try to, as I was meeting this whole world of Catholic tradition, and the idea came to my head while I'm up at Mount St. Michael's in 1992. I'm talking with Sister Mary Gemma, and we're both kind of, there are other traditional groups, and they don't seem to speak to each other very well, and we both kind of, I don't know, commiserated over that fact. And it seemed like, well, there's got to be some way to pull the tribes together, because the traditional Catholics, one and all, are trying to stick with what God gave us originally. That is the motive of every traditional Catholic. You wouldn't be here if that wasn't what you're trying to do, even if here for some folks might be a motu mass, So, I mean, why drive an hour to a motu mass when you got a Novus Ordo across the street? You care about something wanting to be authentic, wanting to be the Catholicism of history, and not some brand new, provincial in time sort of thing that didn't even exist until the 1960s, which gets into some of the doctrines of that. The Novus Ordo religion did not exist until Vatican II. So, to be Catholic, it not only has to be spread throughout the world, it has to be spread throughout time. But the Novus Ordo goes back to Vatican II, and that's it. So it loses that mark of the church right on that one hard fact alone, and nothing they can do can change that. But we'll get to the doctrinal ones in another installment, because that's in a way that's the fun stuff. That's what I want to get to. I feel like a fire hose ready to, but I have to
Right.
hold it
It's
back.
really true that's the, as you say, that's the fun stuff and stuff you want to have a solution to and whatnot. But yeah, you got to start at the beginning, right?
Yeah, begin the beginning. So I thought up there, well, there's all these different people and groups, and I figured there ought to be like a who's who of Catholic traditionalism. I don't know if you've heard of what they call Who's Who. This is a series of books that anybody that's some achievement of some sort gets listed in a book called Who's Who. Um, Basically, I think if you pay them, they'll put your name in it, list whatever your accomplishments are. So I don't think it really means very much. My grandfather made a big deal about being able to be listed in Who's Who, and he had enough accomplishments to deserve it without it, to deserve that. So I was thinking like a who's who. Who are these people? Who's Father Shikata? Who's Michael Davies? Who's Dr. Ramakumar Swami? Who's, just these various figures. Who are they? What's their background? What's their backstory? And who among us do they most directly represent, and why? And what are their disagreements among each other, and why? And so I kind of evolved into something I was just going to call traditional Catholicism, the struggle to preserve the faith, or something like that. And the idea was I would have a section, or maybe it was originally conceived a whole book, just about taking each figure one at a time. Who was Archbishop Fook? And even some of the popes. Who was Montini? What was he about? I mean, a whole book's just devoted to these things. And that was just too massive. Maybe whole chapters. So I remember starting to draft a chapter about Archbishop Fook, because I was trying to glean all the different bits and pieces I could find of his life. Writing about Archbishop Lefebvre is easy. There's so much material. I more have to edit it down more than anything else. But Archbishop Fook was this kind of mysterious figure. I didn't really know a lot about it. Finding information on him has been a real chore. Even to this day, there's a lot I don't know, but there's a lot that I have picked up over the years, and it adds up actually to quite a bit. But anyway, I'm trying to write my initial draft of that, and finally I'm realizing even that's just too large of a subject. So in 1996, I said, I'm going to start fresh. And I began a draft of a new book. I still hadn't yet titled, but I wanted to make it something simple. I wanted it to be something that Joe Sixpack could pick up and go, 0 to 100 in one book. And that's really what the Resurrection book turned out to be. By the end of September, I had written the introduction to this book, which is fairly thin and simple, but it kind of gives an idea of where this thing is going. And it goes to some opening sections that kind of talk about, what is this all about? Why does this matter? And then we get up to the first 5 chapters are really devoted to that. So there was one other discovery that I made, but it's probably best to put that a couple books down that kind of helped a lot, that really explained things to me a lot. So that's kind of made it easier for me to respect traditional Catholics at a lot of different phases. Traditional Catholics at a lot of different phases of their learning. And let's just say you're starting from the Novus Ordo and you got to find your way to the fullness of the faith. How do you do that? But what I wanted to do here was to have the historical narrative, major histories, currents of how things were going, even small details, personal anecdotes, just all these different kinds of things that were going on that are part of the whole legend and legacy of the survival of the Catholic faith into our age. So I'd have a chapter on the earliest priests who refused to go along with the new religion until they even got pushed out of their physical churches, and they just continued on in a hotel room or some other rented space. And there'd be a congregation of Catholics who wanted to stay with the original faith surrounding them. And that it started with that. And there'd be a number of these priests. They knew, they were trained, they knew what was Catholic and what is not, and they were trained in this. And they were going to stay in it no matter what anybody told them. And that's what they did. But then more things had to happen. You can't just have these priests. They'll get old, they'll die, they'll fall off. Who's going to take their place? And we're going to end up in the same situation as I had already been through with the Protestants a few times. And in a way, kind of even my first with the Novus Ordo, because that venerable old Irish priest decided to retire and go back to Ireland. So once again, I am bereft. Although at least in this case, they could send another arch-conservative Monsignor to pick up and carry on. He was a different guy in a different atmosphere, but he was still arch conservative. I have to give him that. And so I was kind of tired of that. We have to have some way to have our faith has to have a future, and it's not going to have much of a future if we're just having to sit there on our own. It has to exist because there are more priests, which means there are bishops. So there's all of this going on. I'm trying to tell the story, most principally, both about the writers, the ideas, the minds, the thinkers. Some are laity, some are priests, a few are bishops or become bishops later on. And some of them, and then there's also especially the bishops and how they came to be bishops and who consecrated who and these sorts of things. So that was also kind of another idea for my who's who. It's like, all right, if so-and-so is a priest, who ordained them? What are the circumstances of that? They're a bishop, who consecrated them as well as who ordained them as a priest? And what are the stories of these things and how they happened? And, you know, all of this is part of what I wanted to stir in. So it's a lot of the same material, just organized into a more, what I consider at least, a more readable form.
And so does that go from like, does that go from 1960 until 2000 or so? Kind of, that's the period of time you're looking at.
I'm not trying to, at this point in this book, I'm more concerned with that which is most specifically where tradition has to begin arising as something distinct from what was going on. I talked about the milieu. Let me just briefly summarize the title, the chapters. Okay, so chapter 1, how to identify the Roman Catholic Church. I talked briefly, very briefly, from a layman's, worm's eye view perspective of the marks of the church. But that's how you know the marks and some of the key attributes. So then I have some biblical and liturgical parallels. So the crisis is not totally unprecedented and unexpected, but history is always able to surprise us. But there are both biblical and other prophetic things that kind of parallel what we're going through. So I kind of talk about that. Then the next one, what I call the juridical impact of the Second Vatican Council, or how the hierarchy lost control. So like I said, that's a whole ball of worms. But I'd say for this one, we'll kind of skip that one, although it really lays out a very good background. It's kind of for the structure of the book. By the time I'm done with chapter 3, you've got 4 categories of human beings alive. You've got those who are truly Catholics, and they're still with the Vatican organization. Well, you had to have had that at the beginning, and we'll talk about why at a later installment. But you also had those who were Catholics but not in that organization. And I could see that the Pius X Society is not part of the Vatican organization, and neither are the Sedevacantists, obviously. And there's other independent priests, as we call them, just other old-time priests who just stayed doing what they're supposed to do, and so forth. So you got a number of different clergy out there, and writers who support them in their ideas, who are obviously no part of the Vatican apparatus, and are obviously nevertheless part of the church. You have that apparatus, which is mostly non-Catholic, but you do have this little Catholic fringe in the form of, then it was the indult, later on the motu proprio. So those people are trying to be Catholic. And the way I saw the whole indult and motu proprio movement, it was like it's trying to establish a Catholic beachhead on what is otherwise a fundamentally non-Catholic organization or society. So I welcome the attempt. I respect it. I respect the intentions of those who involve themselves on that basis. But at the same time, I've increasingly come to the conclusion that I think that's going to be totally futile. But I still respect the desire.
Right. So, it's like it's like a bunch of sailors trying to save an already sunk ship, right? You can't. It's too late. The ship is sunk.
It's like that. Although when it comes to society, sometimes one very motivated person or a small number of very motivated persons can sometimes do something. Let's think of Gideon's 300 men who took on an army of 10,000 because they were the most motivated, the most gung-ho, the most loyal, the best soldiers you could round up. And they went in there and they took on this ragtag army that's a whole lot bigger than they are in terms of numbers. and just totally whooped it because, why would they want to fight God? So then, of course, there's the non-Catholics who aren't part of that, all the Buddhists and Lutherans and what have you, and so forth. So you've got, it's like if you draw a Venn diagram, you've got the intersection of the Catholic Circle and the Vatican Organization, which would be your Indel Fraternity of Peter. You've got all the Catholics that are not in the Vatican Organization, which is where we are, Sedevacantists, also the buyhis X. You see, you'd have the Novus Ordoites, who, of course, are really no part of the church. By the time you get through, you'll understand what I mean by that. And, of course, then there's those outside the whole thing. So I kind of organize this book by the sections after that. So the fourth chapter talks about what I call the Roman Catholic Church versus the people of God. In other words, we have the distinction between what the religion always had been versus what's being put out in the Vatican Organization during and since Vatican II. That has changed everything. And this is what's wrong with Novus Ordoism and why it's not Catholic. So there's so much material. The hardest thing to do is compress it down to one chapter. It was not easy, and it's still kind of a long chapter. Then chapter 5, the Old Catholics, East Orthodox, and the specter of dissent. So that's kind of those who are outside everything. There are still some points I could draw from that. And then we start chapter 6, the beginning of today's stand for the faith. At this point now, the background, the context has been provided. Now we're getting into the history, which is what I really wanted to get to. But there's just, a lot that has to be explained before the relevance of the history can be understood. So the beginnings, and this is where I'm just talking about individual priests here and there. And then 7, the advance of Marcel Lefebvre and the SSPX. In the early days, he was a key figure in helping a lot of priests find the strength and backbone to stand with the true faith. So, despite our complaints about Archbishop Lefebvre not being a Sedevacantist, well, he had his reasons. I don't agree with them, but I understand them. And to some degree, I can even respect them, even as I'm disagreeing. So,
right. I mean, and real quick, I totally agree with that. That I think our view in hindsight of Archbishop Lefebvre is it's really easy for us to judge what he did wrong. And I think, again, personally, I agree with you. I think he did do some things wrong, but it's much easier now, 25 years later, for us to say than it was for his time, because he was a member of that same hierarchy and knew these people personally. I think it was a much more difficult thing for him to completely separate, which I personally can understand.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in some of my later books, a little bit about his reasons personally. But at any rate, then I talk about the bishops of Pierre, Martin, Nagoda, and Thux. And a lot of this biographical material I had assembled about Archbishop Thux, I pretty much imported almost straight whole hog with some modifications, tweaks, and additions to this book here. So it was probably one of the easiest transplants. So that gave me the whole thing about why it's important to have bishops who will continue making bishops of the church. And if we don't, the church runs out. And then we are without a pastor. So how important that really is. So then chapter 9, I specifically address the Sedevacantists, the advance of the Sedevacantists. So there's our starring role. But history continues. So chapter 10, I kind of return back to Marcel Lefebvre and now also Antonio di Castromayor and talk about the whole context and the event of the 1988 consecrations. It was a big to-do and it was a big news story. It's probably the only time traditional Catholicism managed to escape the small circles of those of us directly involved and actually get a notice, however brief, in the national and international news. So, I mean, I have these very vague, dim memories of some news item about some, I don't know, priest or bishop. It had to have been Bishop Lefebvre, but I didn't know at the time, who was doing everything the old way. And I was like, wow, even the Catholic Church has some sects or denominations within it. I didn't know that. I thought it was only Protestants that had that. So it kind of made me wonder about stuff, but I didn't know where to go with that. I had no information. And I just kind of forgot about that again. But it had happened. It was out there. And I even had heard of it, however dimly and remotely, when it had happened. though I was at the time still just transferring over to the Novus Ordo, and I didn't really understand what was going on. Then I have another chapter which I call the advance of the indult priest in the FSSP. Where do they come from? What's their shtick? And what they're trying to do, or well, different people have different motives, but I talk about that here. And the story of that. How did the FSSP get started? How did the Institute of Christ the King get started? This is all historical stuff. And then I finally conclude, and then there's more materials that to kind of sum it all up. And the idea is this is an introduction. I'm trying to present the whole range and milieu of traditional Catholicism in all the various different flavors, who they are, where they are, why they are, because we got to really scratch and scrounge as just ordinary people. And even a motu mass would be preferable to no mass, unless the guy's going to be up there talking about what a great thing Vatican II is every homily he gives.
But that's a sticky question right there, because I think most, as you know,
well, that's true. I know there's
slip
definitely
that by.
There's definitely well, okay. Let me you
Right.
raise a very valid and worthwhile point, and I do agree with that, because there is the point, made. Well, it used to be, strangely enough, Bishop Sambor and the Catholic Diaconate who seemed to be the most adamant about this, until suddenly one day Father Shikata decided to jump on the same train and basically take it over, and have this idea of that priest is saying his mass una cum, one with an obvious arch heretic, or now actually arch apostate. And that's just, it's like it brings this blatant non-Catholic into almost the most central part of the mass. And yeah, and then that should make a Catholic feel uncomfortable. And
but una cum isn't the same issue as the motu proprio.
I actually, what? Sorry, what?
But the una cum isn't the same issue as the motu proprio. Una cum is said
well,
by
there's other
a
things
valid,
with the motu proprio,
a valid
but
priest. Motu proprio is a modern. The priests are modernly, or the bishops are modernly consecrated, and priests are modernly ordained, and I think most groups would agree
that's another problem.
that is a much bigger issue than the una cum.
Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, at the time when I wrote this, there were still a lot of elderly priests, Monsignor McGeezer, as Father Shikata once referred to them, and it's kind of a cute expression, though I felt bad about saying that in the face of one of them who was one of these old priests who had, that I talk about in chapter 6, who had just kept doing the faith whenever, wherever, however he could do it, until finally, when the motu proprio came along, the local Novus Ordo there in Pismo Beach in California, if you want to know, this would be Father Michael Bell. He's deceased now, unfortunately, but he was finally officially invited to be able to come in and do their Latin Mass every 12:30. It even went on their bulletin and everything. So at least he was being hospitable. The Novus Ordo guy was being hospitable. I have to give him that. Meanwhile, Father Bell just kept doing what he'd always been doing. He even brought in his own host, so you're not mixing Novus Ordo hosts with real hosts. I mean, this was the kind of guy that he was. So,
but as you say, though, that's something that's changed. I mean,
that's
as
dying
we can't
off.
judge Archbishop Lefebvre, these priests are almost no longer in existence, and so the motu proprio and
they're
the
dying
FSSP
off.
are.
There is some possibility of validity among the some of the fraternity of Peter, but that's another doctrine for another time also. But valid or not, if you're doing the Novus Ordo, even if, let's say, sometimes you do a Latin Mass that's beautiful, it's gorgeous, and let's say you're even a real valid priest doing it, so it's a full-blown Mass. We'll put on the back burner whether it's going to become a heretic or not. But you're doing a basically Catholic Mass that an ordinary Catholic, if they're attending it, they're going to get pretty much what they would have seen in any Catholic church, 50, 100, 200 years ago. And that's really what's most needed is that. But then he crosses the street and does a Lutheran service. Well, what kind of priest is that? Well, the Lutheran pastor died, so I thought I'd just kind of help out over there to keep those people going. So I'll get up there and I'll do a Lutheran service and give a Lutheran type homily, blah, 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 because I just thought I'd be helping those people, And then I come back, I have another Catholic Mass here at my church, and, what would you think of a priest who did that?
Right. Right, and
Yeah,
so
I
that
mean,
becomes the issue, that the Latin Mass isn't enough, that it is, it's hugely important.
yeah,
The sacraments, of course, are important for our souls and for eternity, but
yeah,
you can't compromise doctrine, dogma, tradition, and truth for what
yeah.
might be valid sacraments, and that's the big point. That I mean, maybe some of them are, probably most of them aren't, and if that's even in a question, then if it's questionable validity, then it is, thus you should not
Well,
attend.
there's definitely problems, and I definitely don't recommend it. But remember, too, also, it is our Mass that is the profession of our faith. That really is. It's not just a little creed, I believe in God the Father, blah, blah, blah. We believe a lot more than that. I mean, the Apostles' Creed, many Protestant denominations will read the Apostles' Creed without a qualm because there's nothing in there that they disagree with. And yet they obviously are a whole different religion than ourselves. Well, not a whole different, but enough different that they're not part of us. They have deserted us. And even so, they don't have a problem with anything in the Apostles' Creed. So this book was presented for everybody, and it's meant for Catholics of all sorts. And the idea is to help people understand where you are, what your dangers are. And now, obviously, in the indult motu area, the dangers are very considerable, significant probability of no valid sacraments. Okay. And the unicum thing, whatever you want to make of it, is just another problem. Then you also have some who will use their homily to push what a great thing Vatican II is, or what a horrible thing all those dirty, rotten Pius the Tenthers or Sedevacantists or whoever out there. They're not part of us. They're bad. And if you're going to get that kind of stuff, you're better off just not going, even if that's the only Mass you've got to go to from where you live. And there you really have to draw a line. It's the same as being, as going to an Episcopalian service or something. You might as well just not bother. You really shouldn't bother, actually. So, but some might say, well, I do try to treat everybody with respect that's in traditional Catholicism. And even as I modify my book, I sustained that. And I'd like to illustrate that, and maybe I'll close with this. As I see it as a path of progress from Novus Ordo to Catholic. And in the first part of this, I mostly detailed my life coming up to the Novus Ordo and a little of beginning to get into the traditional Catholicism, and then I got to writing my book. But let's get to what I had is that there is a sequence. I'm going to just read it. There's a sequence of reasonable and common steps by which a person may come to discover the fullness of the truth if they start from Novus Ordo, providing only that they seek the truth, and at each of those levels, there are found those who are properly to be avoided as dangerous. While there will often be many personal exceptions, the overall general trend seems to be as follows. 1. You realize that there exists a discrepancy between the Catholicism of history and what passes as Catholicism today. Wow, it was really different back then from now. That's interesting. Is there something to watch out for? Yes. Those who claim that the changes are improvements. So yeah, isn't it great? We got it all in English. So now we know what's going on. Isn't that great? No, it's not. Okay. 2, deciding that a commitment to the old ways is in order to the rejection of the new ways. Yeah, I want to go with the old ways. The new, I've looked at it. It's a joke. I can't take it seriously. These are not spiritual people praising God. These are people who come to be entertained. So the main thing to watch out at that level is those who would want to direct their fascination for the old ways to the secular realm of societal issues. We're going to fight abortion, or we're going to, do these different things, fight for communion in the hand, and, these kinds of things, good things in themselves. But if you're going to just be devoted to trying to make your Novus Ordo a little bit more Catholic looking, you still got a Novus Ordo. So that too is dangerous. But let's say you get to the next part. You realize you need to seek a traditional Latin Mass. Or I'm not speaking so much for the other rites here, but there's probably some crude crude comparison. But okay, seek a traditional Latin Mass and hopefully old catechisms and other classical Catholic books. So you discover the Mass. When you've gone into that, even though it's got a lot of problems, it might not be valid. It's priest, there's all kinds of stuff. might not even be a priest, etc. Nevertheless, in going there, you crossed an important threshold, because now you are for the first time really professing the Catholic faith in the manner and ceremony of your worship. Even where it's not sacramentally valid, the ceremonial is Catholic. And so that's a very important threshold. But you don't want to stop there, because what's dangerous is, as well, you can go there if it's one of these approved, but don't go anywhere else like that. That's what you got to watch out for, obviously, or you will not progress. And then the next thing you discover is that you need to oppose the errors of the modernists, even if the modernists are not going to acknowledge you or give you credit or even excommunicate you or anything else. And that's where you discover resist but recognize. Now, we hear the expression recognize and resist. I have a reason for preferring resist but recognize, because I need to give the proper respect to those who are at that level. The real principal thing is to resist the modernist changes, even if it means having to stand alone, which is many independent priests and, of course, the whole Pius X Society and a few other groups do. And that far I can respect. I mean, to the point that they have their own bishops, their own priests, that their bishops ordained, in this case, validly. So that's a major step in their favor. So, but obviously, there's still this recognized part. It's not a major part of the life of your typical SSPX parishioner, but it's there. And one can talk about why that is.
Right. And again, I think the issue that leads to compromise, right? But I'm really with you here, though. And I think that I see where you're going with this.
If you stop there, you don't go any further. Yeah. I mean, I kind of see it as like you're learning mathematics in kindergarten. They're teaching you how to count. But who wants to stay in kindergarten and learn year after year for their whole education how to count? You want to learn how to add, subtract, multiply, divide. You want to learn, square roots and squaring and algebra and geometry and, all these different things. You want to move up. You're not advancing if you just stay at the beginning or any other stage and you don't go any further. You see, and this is the same thing. You're growing in Christ as you come to a better understanding of what's important. We're at the level of what I call resist but recognize. The idea being that in my discovery, there it is, the resistance is really what drives what they do. And the recognize is almost kind of this footnote that they kind of do on the side, because they don't want to judge. They don't want to judge what they call a pope. I mean, judging a pope is a pretty bad thing to do. I mean, and they're afraid to do that. I understand that. Well, the problem, you have to find some way to know that's not a pope before you realize that in judging him, you're not judging a pope. So you're okay. But they don't understand that yet.
Yeah, but real quick though, I mean, some of these guys, they won't judge him, but they will badmouth him and disparage him and say all sorts of terrible things about him behind his back. And I'm not going to listen to him, but he is the Pope, and so I can't officially judge him. It's totally nonsense.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I'm not arguing with any of that.
But in general,
well, it should be obvious what the pitfall is those who say, yeah, you don't want to go with those dirty, rotten Sedevacantists. Stay with us. So there's the pitfall at that level. But let's say you can overcome that pitfall. The next one is, okay, now you're deciding that the recent and current Vatican leaders may not have been, or definitely were not, popes. In other words, you discover what I call the Sedevacante finding. Despite appearances, however crude, to the contrary, the church really has no pope. Certainly, we don't have a pope in any of the recent and current Vatican leadership. And really, we don't have any real pope anywhere else either. So we don't have a pope. And that's just the fact. Now, once we get to that point, now we've arrived at being Sedevacantists specifically. And the reason we get there, and this is where things start getting interesting to me most of all, is because we start getting into the whole theology of all of this. Because up until this point, we've just been thinking like ordinary, not terribly educated laity, trying to scramble for ourselves off of our very limited resources. I mean, what have we got? Some catechisms or something, and some nice preaching, or maybe some saintly writings and so forth. How are we going to figure this stuff out? One has to get into all the intense theology of it all. I mean, even just to understand what are the doctrinal parameters of a pope. And then once we know what that is, what can we show about these people where they have so flagrantly gone wide the mark of those doctrinal parameters that there's just papal infallibility would be a meaningless expression if, despite everything, they could still somehow be popes in God's eyes.
Right.
So that's where you get to the Sedevacantism discovery. Now, the pitfalls haven't stopped, however. There's still pitfalls, I believe. Now, some people are still caught up in these pitfalls. I call them pitfalls. We can work out more what we think about these things as we go on. But here's the thing. All right, having decided that, sometimes people might just say, well, if you go from there rejecting the lawfulness of anyone or any possible source, that brings us like any clergy. So that brings us to that ex-nun of the CMRI who believed there was no place to go for anything Catholic. The only hope was that maybe her friend Ken Mock might be able to organize a conclave, find some untainted priests, bishops, whatever, who come together, have a micro conclave, and somehow carry things on and restore the church and grant all that jurisdiction that basically you end up thinking to disappear. So now you get to the next part, but let's say you get past that, and we're all kind of past that to some degree, because we have to realize we need to decide that something of the real church, at least in the form of valid clergy, that it is lawful for us to approach for the sacraments, must and does exist, and that our willingness to accept such clerics. So, in other words, we go to our priests, Bishop Sanborn or the CMRI or whatever, even an SSPX. At least he's valid and so forth. And there may be funny things they'll say, but the mass will be fine. The school they'll run for the children will be fine. I mean, it's not a bad way to go if it's and especially if that's what you've got where you live. You could probably work with that, with some cautions. So then you get to the final pitfall, and that would be where you begin to believe that authority has really disappeared. That your priest, you can go to him for a sacrament, but he's just a layman with holy orders kind of a thing. That too has to be wrong. But that really gets into what the next part would be about. And how would that be wrong and where that would go, I'd say that's for another installment. So anyway, we get through the important stuff of the book. I want to be respectful of people who are at all stages of that progress, because they're on their way. They are coming. And I think at a certain point, they cross an important threshold into the church once they decide they're going to do the traditional mass exclusively, but they still have a long ways to go.
Right.
It's a learning curve.
People, right, exactly. And I think the normal people, I'm with you. I mean, I think, and I froze again. This computer is going to drive me crazy. The normal people of the SSPX and even the St. Peter's, I do really sympathize with. But I think the people who really drive me crazy are people like these lay theologians or writers or Novus Ordo archbishops who say they're majorly conservative. They bring up words like heresy and apostasy, and then they do nothing. They don't continue. They don't progress. They just stay where they are, and they resist the papacy, or they make fun of the papacy, or they say terrible things about their pope. And yet they still recognize him as Pope, and it gets to be a joke. And I think in many ways it makes the papacy a joke. And I think that's really a shame. The people, I'm with you. I mean, the people, if you're trying to be Catholic, I mean, so many people just don't know. I mean, how can they know? They grew up with it, or they started out as Protestant or Jehovah's Witness, and they go to the nearest church and they say, wow, here's a Latin mass. This is beautiful. I'm going to stay. I mean, how they don't know. I mean, so I think you're definitely right there. But obviously on the other side, it's part of what we should be trying to do is convince them that, as you say, there are further steps, that they're on the right path, but there is a further progress they need to complete.
Yeah. And to be respectful to them as we do that.
Sure.
As the saying goes, you get more flies with honey than with something less pleasant. I forget what the chemical was.
Vinegar.
But the idea is, to attract people.
I don't know if it's very nice calling them.
That's the other thing. Why are we interested in attracting flies when we really should be concerned with attracting, human beings, human souls? Christ died for these souls, and the least we could do is to help them along and help them discover what God has for them, which is
Right.
just so much more. They got to get out of that. Oh, well, at least you've gone into third grade. You can add, subtract, multiply, divide, and that's good. And you can balance your checkbook. So, I mean, it's a good thing, but it's not good if you're going to stultify your development at that point.
Right.
And that's how I
Exactly.
see it. So I'm not going to treat the third grader, oh, well, all you know how to do is add, subtract, multiply, divide. I bet you don't even know what a square root is.
Right.
And
Right.
see,
Exactly.
that's just being unnecessarily disrespectful. And I refuse to do that. And even in my other books, though I'm obviously arguing very specifically for the Sedevacante situation, I'm always treating everyone with respect, because everyone's at different points of their discovery path, and I just want to help encourage them to move forward, and that's what I want.
No, I think that's well said, and I think that that's what we try to do here. So I'm glad to have had you on, because I think, as you say, I mean, if we really truly believe we have the truth, which obviously we do, then we should try to convince people to come to the truth, not to convince them that they're evil and doing the wrong thing, because as you say, honey is
Right.
more attractive, and I think that that's definitely right.
Yeah. And not that they're fine where they're at, even if
Right.
they may still have a useful function in God's providence, which I also believe is part of the picture. I think even as some people advance, new people come in, and it goes on continuously, and the roles seem to serve a providential purpose. Now we see the Novus Ordo, or Bergoglio, is now trying to shut down the motu proprio. So I don't know whether, now that may change back and forth in the years to come, or it may not. It may just be the end of it. In which case, maybe that's a way of indicating maybe Providence has kind of felt that maybe that role has pretty much fulfilled its purpose and isn't needed anymore. Could mean that. Or it could just be that, well, the next guy will restore that, and the guy after that'll, whatever.
Right.
But it doesn't really matter whether they're merciful or generous or not. The bottom line is they, as a society, aren't the church. They don't even know how to make valid priests. Their whole emphasis is all this apostasy and so forth going on. And even if some little enclave manages to maintain a Catholic form of worship, or maybe even have the blessing of a valid priest, and good preaching and so forth, and that does exist. I mean, we have to be fair and honest about it. Those things do exist. They're rare, but they do exist. The fact of the matter is, the idea of having a beachhead on them is kind of losing its value, and I think it's losing its relevance. But as I wrote the book, this was a very key thing in a very key Catholic community worth recognizing, acknowledging, and crediting with what they're doing. So,
well, and when
but individually, I want people to progress. Let new people come into that and then work their way up.
Right.
Third grade goes on to fourth grade, but now there's a new group of third graders who just came from second grade, and so it goes.
Well, and I think when you see but their Pope, who is like the one supposed Catholic not happy about the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and not even saying anything about it. And I mean, how many people are going to go from third grade to graduating college in the next weeks? And I mean that. I really mean that. You're going to have people, even your liberal Novus Ordos, and I really believe this. You're going to have some of your really liberal left Novus Ordo people saying, "Wait, what? I mean, wait a second. What does the Pope believe on pro-life versus pro-choice?" And he hasn't said. I mean, he just had Nancy Pelosi in the Vatican, shook her hand. She is very openly pro-abortion. I mean, guys, he's not a pope. He can't be a pope. It's a joke. He's a total clown, and the Pope cannot be a clown show. This cannot possibly be the church. Please look it up. Read Mr. Ruby's books. Go do some research on this, and I hope to have you on again to go deeper into this, because, as you say, there is a process and people are starting to see this. But I think absolutely, normally you have third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade. I think you're going to have all grades going, whoa, okay, something is wrong. We've got to leave this school. We got to leave this church, because this can't be Catholic. And I think it's going to happen quick.
Well, graduating classes, I figured out the man's not a quote. Congratulations, give me my college diploma now. I mean, I think that there's something to be said for all this, because at some point, maybe you can skip some of the earlier steps. Many
Sure.
people do, and and maybe even to good effect. I mean, in a way, my first introduction was the CMRI, so it's like that's where I still basically am today. So that's not bad. But there was a lot of other things that I knew that not everybody meets up with them, and even my way of meeting up with them was exceptional. So what has to happen is that people need to learn more the depth of it. I mean, you don't just graduate because you can say the right fact. It's great. You got that. You figured it out. Congratulations. So what do you know? What does that mean? Okay. For Mr. Bergoglio is not a pope. Okay. What does that mean? I'd rather save that for another one, for the next one of these. Perfect. Because that could be a good idea to start
that sounds
off.
Good. But exactly. No, that's perfect. I say let's do that, and we'll start off again talking about much more of the doctrinal issues about what is Vatican II, what's going on right now, and we'll definitely have further episodes. We just did an hour 20 pretty much with an introduction, so I have no worries about further episodes. I really appreciate it, and we will attach links to your the Daily Catholic blog post, and as well, if you could tell me and tell the people, how do they buy your books?
Okay, we could do that. I'll email the information. You just put
give me a link.
There,
okay, perfect.
Blurb.
Yep.
Yeah.
Give me a link. I'll attach the link in the show notes. If anyone wants to go check out these books, there are 3, I believe, all having to deal with the situation.
Yeah. After the resurrection comes the Sedevacantism number 1. And then after that comes the Sedevacantism number 2.
Got it.
So 2 is pretty advanced. I mean, you're kind of getting into the college curriculum by the time you're getting to number 2. But 1 is probably where you really should be at if you're ready to graduate. Graduate, and you want to shoot straight to the top. Well, this is the way. I think this is the way to do it. So, well, let's pick this up later on.
Perfect.
Maybe later
Sounds good.
today.
Perhaps we'll see. I have to see how my daughter's doing. She's getting a little bit itchy, but we'll see. I'll see. I hope we can record again. Either way, we'll probably publish a few days later, no matter what. I really appreciate it. And I've learned a lot. I expect to learn a lot more as we go. Anyone who's watched this and enjoyed it, please like, share, subscribe. If you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon and PayPal. That helps to try to figure out this ridiculous internet connection, which dies every single time we do a show. It's the German, it's a crazy German issue with the internet, or it's the devil. I don't know, maybe both. I'm trying to figure out which exactly to blame, but it is a major problem. Anyway, everyone who's listened, thank you so much, and stay tuned until our next shows with Mr. Griff Ruby, where we will discuss further and in depth the Sedevacantist position. Until next time, Mr. Ruby, God bless you.